Hello guys, welcome to another lesson about middle game. In this specific lesson, we're going to be learning about a different position type, which is where we have the isolated pawn. Now, a lot of you have been telling me how much you need to improve your middle game. You don't know what to do when you get to this part of the game. Well, this is what it takes to become a better middle game player. One of the most important parts is to get familiarized with the different position types. Back in lesson number 91, we talked about what to do when we have a locked center. So we talked about how we have to look at the pawn structure. The pawn structure is going to tell us where we need to expand. We need to target the pawn in front of our most forward pawn. So if you look at a position like this one in front of you, you guys should know what to do. If you don't, please help you do this the right way. And when you finish with this lesson, go back to lesson number 91, because as you should know by now, we kept talking about it. And it is really important for you to understand all the things that we're going to talk about in this course. So going back here to the isolated pawn, in this lesson, guys, we're going to learn what to do when our opponent has the isolated pawn. So we get to a position where we manage to get our opponent an isolated pawn. Well, we need to know what to do when that happens. And I know that a lot of you might feel like you already know it, but there's so much to it that I doubt that you guys got this 100%. Like first, you need to know the pros and cons of the isolated pawn. In future lessons, you're going to learn what to do when you have it, because like I briefly mentioned back in lesson number 100, the isolated pawn could be beneficial as well. And we're going to briefly talk about it here again. But at this point in the course, my main priority is that you guys know how to play against it. So we're going to get to it. And I know that back in lesson number 41, 42, we talked about the isolated pawn, but that was just to get you introduced to it. Now we're going to talk about it from a more advanced perspective. Now, before we start talking about more complicated positions with so many pieces, let me show you a simpler position. That way we can start doing this the right way. So anyways, let's get to this very basic position. And let's go over a few things that you guys might know by now. So we're going to go over the pros and cons of the isolated pawn. And then later, I'm going to show you how you should work it if you're playing against it. But then you're going to see that that is not enough, guys. Even if you do everything correct, if you're not familiarized with the principle of the second weakness, you're not going to be able to capitalize in your game. So let's get started from the very beginning. First thing that we need to do about the isolated pawn. The cons is that this pawn is going to become a weakness mainly because our opponent's pieces are going to make us defend this pawn. So if I'm the one with the white pieces now, I have this pawn. I know that the black pieces are going to be putting pressure on it with pieces. And then my pieces, of course, are going to have to defend. So if I had a knight, my knight has to defend. If I had a bishop, the bishop has to defend. If I have a rook, the same thing. So one of the main problems with this isolated pawn is that, of course, it cannot be defended by pawns. So my pieces need to defend it, and that means my pieces are going to be passive. Now, speaking of these, isolated pawns in general, of course, they're weak. Now, isolated pawns in the center are even more delicate because those pieces of our opponents are going to be putting pressure on the pawn that is in the center. So that means that if they have a knight on c6, if they have a bishop on f6, if they have a rook on d8, those pieces are not only attacking my pawn, but they are putting pressure on the most important squares of the board, which are the central square. So that's another bad thing about having that weakness in the center. Another problem with the isolated pawn is, a lot of you should know, guys, from lesson number 52, the square in front of an isolated pawn is going to be a weak square. And we know that a weak square is going to be a square that cannot be controlled by a pawn. So since our pawns are gone, that square is going to be a perfect outpost for our opponent's pieces, especially for a knight. So that's going to be another problem of the isolated pawn. And then finally, in the endgame, this pawn is also going to be a huge liability. As a matter of fact, the closer that we get to the endgame, the bigger of a problem that this pawn is going to be. Not only is it weak, but it is going to be hard for this pawn to help us create anything. So when we have maybe connected pawns, we could use them to create a passed pawn, but this isolated pawn is not going to help us that much. Now guys, before we move on to learn how we deal with this pawn, what's the best approach and everything else, let me tell you briefly And we're going to have another lesson at some point in the future on how this pawn could be really beneficial. But if you're the one with the isolated pawn, some of the pros is going to be the fact that you have open and semi-open files. So since we don't have pawns here to protect the pawn, that also means that those files are open or semi-open for our rook. So mainly our rooks wants to be there. Also, this pawn is going to be offering very good squares for our pieces. So if I have a knight on e5 or on c5, it is going to be protected by this pawn. Also, this pawn is going to give us flexibility, let's say for even our rooks to move up and come over to put pressure on the king side, or even if I have the queen d3, and come over to the king side. So these are things that I'm going to show you more in detail how you could use the isolated pawn to your advantage, and there are many brilliant games won thanks to that isolated pawn. But anyways, now that we talked about some of the pros and the cons, let's go deeper into how to deal with the isolated pawn. Okay, so let's say that you get to a position like this where your opponent has an isolated pawn, your pieces are active, you have a very good position, but one thing that I need you to keep in mind, and little things like this one that I'm going to tell you are going to make the difference. And this is what it takes to be a good middle game player, guys. When you get to the middle game, there are different roles and ideas besides tactics and everything else, roles and ideas that are going to make it easy for you to come up with moves to follow your plan. So the main thing about this isolated pawn is that the way we deal with it, we do not want to take it right away, guys. So we're putting pressure on it, and the main objective, and we talked about this back in lesson, I don't know, when we talked about the Capablanca's endgame, we talked about how the threat is even more powerful than its execution. So it's not so much that we want to get that pawn. Of course, we're going to get to the point where we pick it up, but it is more about making your opponent's pieces passive. I told you about this already, but that's one of the main objectives. And then you're going to see what happens once we accomplish this. I'm going to give you enough examples for you to understand this easily. But just remember, isolated pawn, I'm putting pressure on it. My entire middle game plan is around that objective, the isolated pawn, but there's no rush to take it. Mainly, I want my opponent's pieces to be passive, defending that pawn. Now, with that in mind, let's talk about your strategic plan once you get to this position. Now, this position in front of you is from a game played by Botvinnik, and in this game, you're going to see him very nicely taking advantage of that isolated pawn. Now, before we get to see his plan, I'm going to show you his plan phase 1, his plan phase 2, and then you're going to see how he executed his entire plan. But before we get to it, things that we're going to keep in mind overall, regardless of the position, regardless of the game, whenever you get this position type, you're going to be looking for these things. Number one, we need to block or control the square right in front of that pawn. Mainly what we want is to prevent our opponent from pushing the pawn and trading it. If they trade, if they push the pawn, if they get it into our territory, number one, if it's traded, there's no more pressure on them. There's no pawn to hold. They're going to be equal. And also, even if I didn't have the pawn here, if they manage to push this pawn, let's say there's a bishop on the fianchetto, it's protecting the pawn, that pawn is going to become really uncomfortable. It's going to be restricting my pieces. My position is not going to be the same if that pawn gets there. So I need to control that square in front of it. And if I could block it with a knight, even better. The knight is known to be the best blocker because the knight is not only blocking, the knight could jump over the pawn to also put pressure on very good square. So block the square in front of the pawn. Number two, it's the same thing. Notice that all of these things are the same points that I already talked about. Number two, I want to place my pieces in a way that they're active, they're putting pressure so that my opponent's pieces have to be defending the pawn. Guys, they're not going to remain passive unless you are putting pressure on that pawn. So I need the rook to be putting pressure on it, maybe the two rooks, the bishop putting pressure on it, and so on. So that's going to be number two. Number three, keep in mind that simplification is beneficial for you. So not only is the person with the isolated pawn trying to hold the pawn, but they also want to avoid trading pieces. Remember, the closer that we get to the endgame, the more of a liability that this pawn is going to become. So number one, we want to control or block the square in front of the pawn. Number two, activate our pieces, put pressure on it to make his pieces passive. Number three, if we get to simplify pieces, even better. And we need to control the open or semi-open files. So our rooks are going to be going to those files, guys. So you already know where your minor pieces go, controlling the square in front and putting pressure on the actual pawn. Then the rooks, they go to the open or semi-open files many times, and you're gonna see it in the examples that I'm going to give you. Many times both rooks actually double up to put pressure on the weak pawn. And then lastly, what do we do with our queen? Guys, typically your queen wants to be on the long diagonal, but more than being here a little bit passive, we want it to be centralized. So if we could get this queen to e5, that's going to be a great square for the queen. Not only is the queen active, contributing to this battle for the isolated pawn, but the queen is also putting pressure on the king side and so on. And you're gonna see how this is going to be important when we talk about the principle of the second weakness. So if we do this, you're gonna see it now in an example that I'm going to give you from Botvinnik. But if we do these things, trust me, you're going to be able to capitalize on this weakness. Now guys, if we do all of this properly, but you miss a fork, you miss a tactic, then there's no point. That's why I'm trusting that you're also practicing, you're training your tactics along the way. So anyways, with all of these things in mind, let's take a look at what Botvinnik did in this game. So I'm going to be giving you 3 examples, and at the end, I'm going to leave something for homework. I'm going to give you games after for you to go over and learn more about it, but let's take it one step at a time. Okay, so this position comes after the black pieces did queen to a5. So of course, they need to deploy the queen, and now it is the white pieces to move. Now, don't forget, we're already controlling the square in front of the pawn. Next, we're going to be activating our pieces to put pressure on the pawn so that the black pieces need to be passive if they want to keep the pawn. Now, the first move for the white pieces is rook f to d1. Now, of course, we're putting the f rook on d1 because the other nice file for the rooks is going to be the c file. So if I had put, and I know this is pretty basic, but if I had put this rook here, then the f rook is going to be a little bit weird on f1. So one goes on d1, one on c1. Of course, this one is the one coming to d1. So we start putting pressure on it. Not only are we putting pressure on the pawn, but we're controlling the square in front of it even more. I know that I keep saying the same thing, but it is extremely important. By the end of this lesson, in a week, in 2 weeks, this is one of the things that I want you to never forget. We need to control the square in front of it. Now, after rook f to d1, the black pieces did rook a to d8, and notice how the white pieces already accomplished their first task. We're starting to get the black pieces to remain passive. These rooks are supposed to be, guys, when you have the isolated pawn, you want, one of the benefits of the isolated pawn is, like I mentioned before, we get semi-open and open files. So the rooks are supposed to go there. But now that we force them to put the rook on d8, then this is a different story. That rook is going to be passive behind the pawn. So anyways, after rook a to d8, we have rook d2. We know what this is for. Rook d7, and then rook a to d1. So notice how this excellent player, all of his plan, all of his moves are around putting pressure that pawn. So this is why a lot of you guys have told me, oh, when I get to the middle game, I don't know what to do. Well, if we get really good at these different position types, and this is just one of them, you're going to know for the most part what to do. It is going to be easy for you to come up with the right moves. So anyways, after rook 1 to d1, we have rook f to d8, then pawn to h3, pawn to h6. Okay, so at this point, the rooks are where they're supposed to be. The queen is still not centralized, but it is on the long diagonal. We want that. Now, what do we do with the knight and the bishop? Now, guys, this bishop, we want it on f3. That's where the bishop is going to be able to put pressure on the pawn. Now, the knight, we wish we could have it on f4. From f4, it is going to be putting pressure on that pawn. So imagine the knight on f4, the bishop on f3, Now, the problem is that if we want the knight to get from f3 to f4, we need to move it around. We need to do 91, 93, 94, and that's going to allow the black pieces to do something that they're going to be looking for all the time. They're looking for the opportunity to do pawn to d4, and that's going to solve all of their problems, especially now that their pieces are active. If they manage to do, let's say we get 91, pawn to d4, if they get rid of that weakness, then they're going to be in a very equal position, especially since their pieces are active. It's a different story when they get rid of the weakness and they're still behind in development. In this case, their pieces are really active. So anyways, 91 is definitely not accurate because of d4. So now if we just to show you a little bit more, pawn takes, knight takes d4, let's say we take, then take. So if all of this happens after queen e1, bishop f1, the most you get is an equal position. I don't see you, unless your opponent makes a silly mistake, I don't see you winning this position. This is by no means, this is going to be better for white. So this is something to keep in mind, and now you see why I keep repeating the same thing, boring, control the square in front of the pawn, because many people know all of this, and then I've seen it with my students. They do everything perfect, but then they forget about controlling the square in front. So everything that they accomplished vanishes after your opponent manages to push the isolated pawn. So anyways, that's why in this case, what the white pieces did instead was, okay, since my knight cannot get to f4, what if I trade knights? Now remember, we talked about this, I think, in lesson 74. When it comes to simplifying pieces, I told you already, if my opponent has an isolated pawn, well, simplification is good for me. But when it comes to simplification, it's not so much about where you are trading, it is about what is left on the board. So from the white piece's perspective, beyond anything else related to the isolated pawn, this bishop is a bad bishop. It is the pawn in the center, the isolated pawn is the same color. In other words, this bishop doesn't have a good scope. So if I trade the knights, I'm going to be left with a very good bishop versus a bad bishop. Now, if I do knight to d4, it's not so clear that they have to trade. So that's why Botvinnik just did knight e5. Now I'm attacking the rook, I'm attacking the knight, and of course the black pieces took, and then queen e5. Guys, by doing this, we left our opponent again with a bad bishop, but also notice how my queen is now not only on the long diagonal, it is centralized. And this is very important on the second phase of the plan. Now, if we go back all the way, so just a few moves. Now, from this position, let's take a look at the plan that I had put on the side over here for you. So the phase one of the plan was to double up the rooks on the d file. That's where the pawn is. Number two, we want to trade the knights, and now you understand why we wanted to trade the knights, or why you wanted to trade the knights. Then we wanted to centralize the queen, and then finally we want to put the bishop on f3 for obvious reasons. So after we accomplished that, so notice what he did. Again, rook f to d1, we forced the black rook to stay passive behind the pawn, then we double up the rooks, and after that we have knight e5, forcing them to trade the knight, the queen gets centralized, and now once we do bishop f3, phase one is going to be completed. So we have queen c5, bishop f3, look at this, all of the good pieces that we have are putting pressure on d5. So after bishop f3 we have pawn to b6, then queen goes back to b2, rook c8, queen e5, so we need to put pressure back on d5, and this is an excellent example on how the black pieces are kept passive. The moment that this rook wanted to get active, the queen came back, so the rook had to come back in line and remain passive. So after rook c to d8, we have rook d4, and guys, this is already a very good position for the white pieces. This rook is not only finally making sure that the pawn is not going to move at all, but now this rook could come over to the king side, and this is part of the second part of the plan. Now, like I told you before, a lot of my students, they understand this far, they find that their opponent has an isolated pawn, they remember to control the square in front of it, they activate their pieces and everything else, but once they get to this ideal position, they don't know what to do next. And that's going to be the case for a lot of you, unless you remember to use the principle of the second weakness. Now, the principle of the second weakness, if you're not familiar with it, very simple. And by the way, this is a principle that is especially important towards the end game. So what it says is that if your opponent already has a weakness, a liability, well, we need to look for a second weakness. They could easily defend this one like they're doing right now, but if we create a second thing for them to worry about, they will not be able to take care of both. Now, in this case, what we're going to do, the second part of the plan, is push these pawns so that we force them to create weaknesses so that we gain more space, and then our attack is going to be effective on the king side. Now, this is only possible because notice how the black pieces are not able to easily switch gears and attack our king. So if not, I would never push the pawn in front of the king. So g4 is something that we're looking for. If we get to g5, we're already creating weaknesses around that king, and we could even use the g file for our pieces. Notice how it is easier for our pieces to come over to the king side than it is for his pieces. So anyways, now we're going to be going for part 2 of the plan. So after rook d4, by the way, notice how the white pieces are also in control of the dark squares. The queen, the rook, the pawn, they are controlling the dark square. So after pawn to a5 by the black pieces, guys, if you feel like the black pieces are not doing their best, well, try to play this as the black pieces. It's really hard to do anything because of the fact that, again, the black pieces are tied up to the defense of that pawn. So after a5, we have pawn to g4. Guys, after this lesson, there's no excuse. If you got this far in the game, you did what you had to do about the isolated pawn, and then you stayed there, you don't know how to make progress, then there's no excuse. You should know that we need to create a second weakness. So in this case, pawn to g4, then queen goes to c6, finally g5, and now after they take, queen takes on g5, and it's a matter of time before we move the king out of the way and we start putting pressure down the g file. So after queen g5, we have pawn to f6. This is not actually helpful, it's just creating even more weaknesses. But just so you know, guys, in case that you're asking yourself, what if they just do bishop h3? Now, it might seem logical, you're getting the pawn, the queen could even come over to help. Well, if that happened, it's not going to be any better for the black pieces, because taking that pawn is going to give us an extra tempo, hitting the bishop and getting set to attack. Now we could even use the h file instead. Of course, the black pieces did not capture on h3, they just did pawn to f6, now queen g6, occupying that square, bishop f7, and then queen g3, staying on the g file. Now this rook could even get in front of the queen. So after queen g3, we have pawn to f5. Guys, this move might seem logical because they're controlling g4, but this is nothing more than another weakness. Not only is that pawn a little bit weird on f5, but now this bishop keeps getting worse and worse and worse. If we keep putting pawns on the same color as the bishop is going to have even less mobility. So after pawn to f5, we have queen to g5, the g5 square, the dark square is available again. So we have queen e6, then king gets out of the way, ready to bring the other rook to the g file, then queen goes to e5, rook to g1, very logical move. Notice how the position is asking for the right move. So after rook g1, rook f8, passive move for the black pieces, aggressive moves for the white pieces. So after rook f8, queen h6, notice how the rook here allows the queen to get to h6. So rook goes to b8, then rook h4. So 1, 2, 3, all of the major pieces are coordinated, putting pressure on that king. So the king goes to f8. Notice how the queen is guarding here. So that's one of the reasons why they put the rook on that specific square. So check anyways. Now bishop g8, just getting more and more passive. And now rook f4, and the third weakness that they created, that f5, is going to be the first to fall. So just to show you how the game ended, guys, rook b to b7, then rook goes to g5, again putting pressure on f5, rook f7, and now queen h5. So look, all of our pieces are putting pressure now on f5. Before, it was on d5, now we found a new weakness and we're going for it. So queen h5, notice how we're not looking for a fancy checkmate or sacrifices. Sometimes we get ahead of ourselves and we sacrifice pieces when All we need to do is hold and keep putting pressure on our opponent. Don't forget, even if you feel pressure like, oh, I'm attacking, I need to find the right move, don't forget that your opponent is also under a lot of pressure. They're defending. If you make one mistake, your attack is going to be gone. If they make one mistake, then they're going to lose the game because of checkmate. So anyways, after queen h5, we have queen a1 check, of course, no big deal. We get to g2, then pawn to g6, queen takes g6, already material is dropping. Bishop h7, queen goes to d6 check, again, using the dark squares. There's no dark square bishop. Rook f blocks, and then after queen d8, the black pieces simply resign. Guys, there's not much more here for the black pieces. If they had done something like king f7, we could easily do bishop takes d5, queen takes d5. If they had blocked, well, we could even just take on f5, guys. The king has to move, we're going to take the queen. You could even go back to d6. There's of course so much here for you to do that the black pieces had to resign. Now, the most important thing for you to remember is how this game transformed from this position. Let me see. So all the way back here, where we identified that isolated pawn, and then the position asked for the move. If you knew the overall plan, then it is very easy for you to make the right decision. So we have to control the square in front of the pawn and put pressure on that pawn. So, and then after rook a to d8, we double up our rooks. Very simple maneuver. Then they had to come back and defend. After that, we understood that we wanted to remove knights and leave our good bishop versus their bad bishop. So after h3, h6, knight e5, the queen now is not only on the long diagonal, it is also controlling the square in front of the pawn. It is also centralized. And then queen c5, bishop f3. Finally, all of our pieces putting pressure on that pawn, the pawn that cannot be pushed. And after that, we're going to think of the principle of the second weakness. There's already one weakness. What if we start expanding on the king side? Of course, only because our pieces cannot go after our king. That's the only reason why we're going to expose the king. And don't forget that after these moves, the rook had to go back. Then we activate our rook, ready to switch to the king side, and at the same time blocking the pawn. Don't forget that by the time that we do g4, we're also going to be using that file for our pieces. So we switch from a strategic game, just putting pressure on the pawn, we switch to an attacking position where tactics are really important. So this is where you see tactics and strategy coming together. So just to show you, queen c6, g5 finally, then f6, queen goes to g3, staying on the same file as the king, and then queen g5, back to the dark square, king h1, making way for the rook to come to the g file, and the rest was history. So rook comes over, then check, putting pressure on f5, the other rook, both pieces on the dark squares, then the queen comes over, there's no need to get desperate, check, and after we take the pawn, everything else is going to crumble. Check on the dark square again, and from here, guys, feel free to even put this on the engine and see if you can finish this against the most difficult level that your engine has. So anyways, okay, at this point in the lesson, we have two more examples that I want to show you. I want to show you this one and another one that is for you to see the isolated pawn in the end game. Now, I'm not going to go too much in detail. I'm just going to show you the moves, and I hope that you can appreciate the different patterns, the different ideas that we have talked about already. So this one specifically, guys, this is played by Karpov versus Spassky, and you should be familiar with both of them by now. So let me show you how this game continued. Karpov was the white pieces, and as you can see, he's playing against an isolated pawn. So he already has the pawn, the square in front controlled, so that pawn is not going to be pushed anywhere. Now it's just a matter of making sure that the black pieces have to stay passive, protecting the pawn, and then from there, we're going to find a way to create a second weakness. So let me show you how the game continued. So again, I'm not going to go that deep into the different moves. I just want you to see more, to have more information regarding this topic. And guys, by the way, at the end of the lesson, I'm going to show you the minimum that you should know. A lot of my students, when they're getting started and we talk about it, I don't tell them so much about it. I just make sure that they get one part, and I'm gonna tell you more about it towards the end of the lesson. So anyways, white pieces to move. Karpov is doing the next move, and feel free to pause the video right now and come up with your own plan. So where am I going to put my rooks? Where am I going to put my queen? At what point I'm going to look for the second weakness, and so on. And then you compare to what you're going to see in this game. So first move for the white pieces was rook d3 exclam. And the idea is that, as you should know, we're going to double up rooks on the d file. But notice how he put the rook on d3. The idea is that not only do we want the rooks on the d file, we want also the queen. And if you guys are not familiar with, how is it called? I think it's called the Alekhine's Gun. And by the way, I'm going to be showing you one of the games is going to be played by Alekhine. Now, the Alechine's Gun is when you have the 3 major pieces doing a battery. So anyways, rook to d3, then rook c to d6. Immediately, notice how the black pieces are getting passive behind that pawn. So rook f to d1, then rook 6 go back to d7, rook 1 goes to d2. Now, this is just making space for the queen to get behind. So after rook d2, queen b5, then queen to d1, all of this is consistent with our plan. So pawn to b6, we saw this in the other game as well. So the defensive side, or at least the side protecting the pawn, is trying to get that pawn away from this diagonal. So pawn to b6, then pawn to g3 by Karpov, and you're going to see how interesting this move is. So bishop f8, then bishop to g2, a very strategic game, very quiet maneuvering. They're not getting desperate. So after bishop g2, we have bishop e7. Whenever I'm playing a game and I see my opponent doing something like this, I know that they just don't have a plan. They're waiting for us to get desperate and to make a silly mistake. So it is your job to recognize this and remember to keep it simple. Let your opponent be the one who gets desperate. Let your opponent be the one getting frustrated and making silly mistakes. So anyways, after bishop e7, then the queen goes to h5. Notice how now not only are we putting pressure on that pawn, we're also putting pressure on the king side. And the person with the black pieces is simply uncomfortable. I know that they're going to be creating something on this side of the board, but I cannot do much. All of my pieces are passive. So pawn to a6, look at this. It's nothing that we have to be concerned with. So after pawn to a6, h3, queen to c6, king goes to h2, queen back to b5, and now Karpov goes pawn to b4. So notice how he is expanding on the king side. So for starters, we're threatening to do f5, getting that bishop, but more than anything, we're taking the initiative on the king side. Again, the black pieces know it, and they're just getting frustrated. There's not much they could do, especially now that we have even this bishop on this diagonal. So after f4, of course, pawn to f6, they need to make some room for the bishop to back up in case of f5. But now we have queen to d1, so the queen is coming back away from the king side, putting pressure, but still putting pressure on d5. And guys, this is going to allow the white pieces to continue to expand on the king side. So queen d1, queen to c6, pawn to g4. And don't forget, the person with the black pieces is Boris Spassky. So this is not a beginner or anything like that. This is another very strong player, and it's simply that it didn't have any plan. They just couldn't do anything about it. So after pawn to g4, pawn to g5, so he had to do something, but this is not helping. If anything, it is going to be creating even more weaknesses. So king h1, there's no rush, then pawn to a5. Now pawn to f5, the bishop has to back up to f7. And now that the bishop is not defending the rook anymore, we have two defenders, and we have the Alechine's Gun putting pressure on this file. Of course, we're going to do pawn to e4. And of course, notice how the pawn cannot even push. So typically, we blockade the pawn and then we do this move. But in this case, it is not even necessary. And you know what? This is what I was going to tell you at the end. A lot of my students, guys, what they know about working against the isolated pawn is to get rid of the minor pieces and leave the major pieces on the board to put pressure on the isolated pawn. After they blockade it, and finally they do e4. The blockading it part is important because many times if d4 is not secured enough and we do e4, they could push and continue to keep the isolated pawn. But in this case, we have a pin on the pawn. So e4 happened and there's nothing that the black pieces could do about it. So king to g7, e takes d5, Now that pawn, not only did we get a free pawn, but we got ourselves a pass pawn, and even though it is isolated, notice how the pawn is in their territory, protected by the bishop. So now this pawn, if anything, is restricting his pieces. It is making it very uncomfortable for them to play. So e takes c5, queen has to move to c7, then rook e2, switching gears, pawn b5, and now this is another example, another idea, something that you're going to see a lot from this moment on. Many times, tactics and strategy come together. So after you get such a superior position, we typically are going to finish it off with tactics. And this, we talked about it when we looked at Capablanca's games. It has to do a lot with Capablanca's style. He'll be outplaying his opponent, improving his position strategically, positionally, and then he would finish the game with a very simple tactic. Now, before I tell you the move, see if you haven't found it, if you haven't thought of it, see if you can pause the video and find a simple tactic. So if you found it, congrats. The move that we're looking for is rook takes e7. Then when the rook gets to e7, we got a fork, and we're going to get the rook back, and we're only giving the pawn in exchange for the rook. So at the end of the day, we got rook and bishop. We're giving up rook and pawn. So rook takes, and pawn to d6 with a very powerful fork. And guys, at this point, Spassky found queen to c4. So now we have to be careful, because if we take, they're going to be taking our rook. But I'm going to leave it here, see if he can come up with the next move for the white pieces. Again, feel free to pause the video. If you already saw the move, congrats. But basically what we need is the queen to leave this pressure on the rook. So the move that Karpov did now was pawn to b3, the queen has to leave because we're going to get that queen, and then we collect on e7. And guys, at this point, after b3, of course, Spassky just resigned. Even if they had just taken on b3, we could easily, among many things, we could just take and then collect on e7 because we're going to promote after. Alright guys, so here you got it. Second example. I hope that it gave you more information, a better understanding of this topic. I'm going to show you one final example, if you're not tired yet, for you to see how the isolated pawn is also a burden towards the endgame. So anyways, in this position, the white pieces just did king f2. All of us know endgame, we need to activate the king. So after king f2, king f8, then king e1. Notice how the king is coming towards those pawns. We're going to activate the king to help us out. So after king e1, of course, we have king e7, king d2, king to d6. And now we do not want that king to get active, so we're going to do pawn to b4. Always not only thinking about our plans, activating the king, but also trying to prevent our opponent from getting active themselves. Now, that reminded me, going back here, maybe some of you thought of, instead of going to e1, of using this route instead. The problem with king g3, guys, is that the black pieces could do the same thing. Oh, you want to get to f4? Well, pawn to g5, and it's going to keep you away from activating the king. Even if you did something like h4, they could just do h6 and keep a pawn on g5. So that's why we did king e1, king d6, and now we're being prophylactic or just simply paying attention. So pawn to b4. Now knight e8. You're going to see how this knight is going to go from f6, where it defends the pawn, to c7, where it is also defending the pawn. So that pawn is simply making it difficult for the black pieces. Now notice how our knight, since the middle game, is on d4, blockading that pawn, but it is also on very good squares, even limiting this bishop from accessing f5 especially. So you're gonna see, guys, even in endgames, you're going to see patterns that tells us how the white pieces played the middle game with the isolated pawn. So anyways, after knight e8, bishop d3, activating the bishop, then pawn to g6, and king to c3. So not only are we activating the bishop, we're also activating the king, of course. So knight goes to c7, then pawn to a4, pawn to b6, and then pawn to a5. B takes a5, b takes a5. Guys, we're just making our way. First, our pawn is on a square that the bishop cannot attack it, and at the same time, we are fixing their pawn on a square where we're putting pressure. So right now, it's not only this weakness on d5, but also the weakness on a6. I know that we also got an isolated pawn on a5, a weakness, but it is not easy for them to take advantage of it. So anyways, after b takes a5, we have king c5, and now knight b3 easily kicks the king back in order for our king to get improved. So knight b3, king d6. Now king goes to b4, knight goes to e6. They don't want us to do knight c5. Notice how we're working on the dark squares and we're getting active. So after knight e6, we have pawn to g3. Then knight goes back to d8. Again, the black pieces do not have a clear plan. So knight goes back to d4, knight c6 check, and we trade pieces happily. Now our bishop is putting pressure on that weak pawn. Their bishop has to be passive defending it. Our king is clearly easily going to work on the dark squares, put pressure on the isolated pawn, and eventually we could even put pressure on it. Guys, very important. We do not want to put pressure on that pawn. I know this is obvious, but many people make this mistake. We do not want to put pressure on that pawn with another pawn because we're helping them get rid of it. We want to pick it up for free. We don't want to trade it for another pawn. So anyways, after the king took on c6, we have pawn on f4. And notice how all of the pawns are on dark squares. Plus, we continue to expand on the king side. The bishop is tied up to the defense of the pawn. The king is tied up to the defense of the pawn. Now, black pieces did f5. Look, all of these pawns are on the same color of the bishop. We could say this is right now a very bad bishop. We know it. Some people call it a long pawn. The point is, it is just a bad bishop. And I can clearly see a route for my king to get in. So after f5, pawn to h4, king to d6, and now we have pawn to h5. Guys, this is a very typical pawn sacrifice in the endgame to simply destroy the pawn structure even more. So now if they take, look, isolated, 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 isolated. All of their pawns are not only on the same square as the bishop, but they are isolated pawn. So h5, very strong move, just something else for you to have in your database. Whenever you're playing an endgame, this is something else that you should consider. It doesn't work every time, but again, it's just a resource to have at the back of your head. So after h5, they took, then king goes to c3, time to activate the king, then king to c5, they're not gonna let us do that. Bishop f1, very powerful move, guys. Now we are looking for that Suk1 position. So this king should not move from here. It doesn't have any moves. If it leaves, our king goes in. If the bishop moves, then the defense of this pawn is going to be even more difficult if the bishop goes to b7. So bishop f1, bishop b7, bishop e2 right now, and no one can protect that pawn. So after bishop e2, again, black pieces are in Suk1. Bishop d3, don't forget, this pawn is going nowhere. We are now putting pressure on both pawns, and this bishop is in Suk1. So this is a complete Suk1 position. So bishop f1 is an exclam, brilliant move. Bishop d3 is another brilliant move that you can only find if you understand endgames. So Suk1 position completely. If the king moves, our king gets active. If the bishop moves to b7, we get this pawn. If the bishop goes somewhere on this diagonal, we get these pawns. And guess what? Either one of these pawns is more important than h5 because collecting f5 lets us get a pass pawn. Collecting a6 also gives us a pass pawn. Taking h5, not really. So anyways, bishop d3 happened, and now pawn to d4, Suk1, they have to give you something. So they decided to do d4, e takes d4 check, king goes to d5, then bishop c4 check, king goes to d6. Guys, forget about going to e4 because then we just push the pass pawn. The king cannot get back in front of the pawn. d6, at some point we could even do some deflection to promote. That would be just even easier. So king to d6 happened, and now pawn to d5 anyways. We have a passed pawn, we're going to push it. So king goes back to c5. Now pawn to d6 just to get the king back to d6, and we activate the king. Guys, this endgame, as you can see, it's not that easy to play. We have to find really good moves, but I'm not going to go deep into it. I'm just showing you for you to see how from the moment there was an isolated pawn, the white pieces were able to build up on it. So anyways, in this case, they sack the pawn, we take the opposition, and after bishop b7 and bishop f1, the black pieces resign. Guys, the same thing is all about Suk1. This king is preventing us from getting in, so all position, you know that whoever moves first allows the other king to gain more space. The bishop has to be here defending that pawn. And this bishop, I mean, you could have done even bishop e2 to just start collecting pawns, but there is no rush. Like always, feel free to put this against the engine and see if you can finish this endgame, if you could win this position. All right, guys, so the only thing that we have left to do, I know it was a long lesson. As you can see, it is getting more annoying, a little bit more difficult, but the only thing left for you to do is do some I'm gonna leave you some homework. There are 2 positions in front of you, and I'm leaving in the description of the video or in the comments, I'm going to leave you the link to the entire game. So these are games for you to see more about this topic, but what I want you to do, if you have the time, try to look at these positions and come up with your plan. What are you going to do overall? What is going to be the place for your pieces and so on? And then you're going to look at the games. Again, I'm leaving the link in the description, and you're going to compare if your plan, your moves, your ideas were consistent with what was done in the game. Also, at some point in the next few lessons, we're going to learn a new opening, and that opening is most likely going to allow you to get these kind of positions where this position type that we just learned, isolated pawn, either you're going to be the one with the isolated pawn or you're going to be able to leave your opponent with an isolated pawn. But in either case, it is going to allow you to get more experience with it. So with that said, like always, we'll talk in the comments. I hope that you guys let me know in the comments your evaluation of the homework exercises, and I'll see you guys again in our next lesson.